Hello, bricks, chicks, and minifigures. You are listening to AFOLs Welcome, where we talk about all things Lego from the perspective of two adult collectors. I am your host, West, and today we are going to be talking about a niche line of sets in the Creator Expert or Icons line. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Lego airplanes. Before we begin the episode, as you've probably noticed by now, Grinch is not here. His little builder arrived earlier this week, and he is a little busy at the moment. This is his first weekend home with the bebe, and he and Mrs. Grinch are busy working through that transition in their life. So I know we all wish the best for Grinch and Mrs. Grinch and Grinch Jr., but they are working through that right now. I know Grinch misses being on the podcast this week and is excited to come back next week. So this is a little bit of a West takeover of AFOLs Welcome this week, and I hope you enjoy. Next, we will talk about what I built last week. So this week, I didn't have a ton to build. I didn't get anything new or start any new projects, although I do have a sizable backlog to get into. But I did play around with Stud.io, and so I think it kind of counts for what I'm building this week. But I've been kind of tinkering with the front of the Lego Pet Shop modular brownstone apartment house and trying to find a way to incorporate those new curved window pieces into that modular. And my intent here is to kind of give the front of that building a little less of the kind of gaps that the set actually has using those hinge plates, right? And I've been moderately successful over the last year and a half trying to find a way to adjust that with these newer pieces, which I think are really exciting to see. But I haven't quite dialed it into where I would say it's modular worthy. And so I'm exploring the building techniques used on the Lego Tudor corner modular that just came out, using that curved window piece and using kind of an interesting inset technique. And so far, it's working okay. I'll be honest. I'm not super thrilled with the progress I've made. It's really hard in between the seams of the floors on modular buildings to incorporate a continuous build if that's what you're planning. And if you're studied in the modulars, you'll notice that Lego doesn't really do that very often. The only time they've really done that, I think, really, really well was the Lego Diner, where they incorporated that front sort of glass facade on every single floor really, really well. But other than that, it's definitely something that's a little bit challenging. And we'll see, curious to hear if any listeners have some great ways to incorporate those curved pieces into like bay windows. But like I said, I am still struggling. So working through that using Stud.io, that's kind of fun. I don't use it a ton. And so it's neat to kind of play around with that and kind of get an idea or sense of what makes sense and what doesn't. So there's a little bit of a learning curve to Stud.io. And for listeners who haven't used it before, I highly recommend using a desktop with a mouse. That's very helpful. And a larger screen where you can have multiple pages up at once, especially if you want instructions to go alongside Stud.io. But it's a very fun program to use for builders. I know lots of mock builders build it or use it to build their mocks. I know Grinch uses that when he's mock building digitally. So it's a very fun piece of software to use with some time and patience, but a great way to kill some time if that's what you're trying to accomplish. And next, let's talk about some exciting Lego news.
Exciting Lego news.
This week we really had, it was kind of another quiet news week. We just came off the news of the Twilight House, which was really exciting. And we got some more information on the Netflix One Piece series. And we got a reveal of the French Cafe set, which is retailing for $79.99. And it's part of what looks to be a new series in Icons, a sub-series, if you will, called the Restaurants of the World. And this is a strange and interesting set. I'm looking at it a picture now, so I can kind of more accurately describe it to you, the listener. But it's the facade of this French cafe done on this cobblestone street. The base is kind of a black base that you would have seen in something like the Zen Garden or the garden, the Spanish Garden. So kind of a similar take there. There's a really nice little bit of detail being done to create that cobblestone technique. It looks like there's some studs on the side construction there, which is why it's built up. Looks like 5 plates high at kind of the main level. And then from there, we actually have the building itself, and the building is sitting on top of that, and it's kind of a corner cafe. It has 3 distinct sides with the door set in the middle. It's not to minifigure scale. And what I mean by that is a lot of the techniques, the build techniques to build this set are techniques that you would see potentially in a minifigure scale city, to include some of the accessories like cups, and there's a cupcake and a croissant in minifigure scale. And the doors to open up the cafe are just the 3 by 5 panel doors that we know are minifigure scale, right? So we have this really interesting, those double doors, and what I really like about these double doors in particular are they have this really cool gold printing inlay on them. So that might be worth just picking up to have for a city or something like that. But it's just an interesting set. There's no minifigures in the set. The color palette, they're using some sand greens, some regular green, and then that light nougat, that flesh tone color is sort of the more prominent color, combined with some white accents on the building and some gold accents. And it looks really good. There's some great, like I said, great pieces used here. There's some great colors. So we're getting, like I said, more of that light nougat color that was first introduced in the boutique hotel. There's a nice printed tile at the top that says Cafe Fleu. And so there's some really interesting pieces here and interesting part usage on the model. But again, I'm just not entirely sure what the purpose of it is. It does look like it's about 6 to 8 studs deep, just kind of a rough estimate at the picture I'm looking at the moment. And so the actual facade of the building is not that deep itself. And if you get a chance to look at the back of it, it's not meant for display. So it's clearly meant to be displayed out front. And because this is part of this Restaurants from Around the World series, it feels like Lego is trying to tee up, this is the beginning of something bigger, where much like the Zen Garden and the Spanish Garden, right, we could expect to see more restaurants from around the world. And so I think this is a very, I've used the word niche already in this episode, but this is a very niche set that I think the cultural penetration of a set like this, I just don't know how much Lego, the adult fans of Lego are really going to go after this set, right? Because it's not really a modular. I think you could potentially incorporate it into a city, but we have things like cafes and stuff already, to include the great French restaurant modular building. And so we weren't necessarily looking for something like that in the city landscape. And so I really think this is really purely meant to be a display model. And this is just going to be one that I would call a shelf sitter, or a dust collector. And if that is the enjoyment that you get out of these type of models, I think that's great. Certainly the building experience plays a part in that, right? So I can totally see why someone might be motivated to go pick this model up. But I think at the end of the day, I'm hoping this is meant to be sort of a more limited series than more like a wide run. Although, like I said, there's some really great parts here, so I'm sure a lot of people will be picking this up at a minimum, just as like a parts pack. But where this goes will be really interesting. Lego, being a Danish company, kind of has a Northern European, Western, North American flair to it in terms of the buildings that they design and create, and kind of, for the most part, the audience they're looking to target. And so this is, I think, one more opportunity to explore maybe some influences from elsewhere in the world. I'm specifically thinking of, if you really wanted to kind of get more edgy with something like this, you could explore, the relationship with restaurants and the way that people around the world live their lives. And so one of the things that comes to mind, right, would be for something like Japan, for example, you could do the facade of like a Lawson or a 7-Eleven, maybe branded, maybe not. It's not really important, right? But those kind of quick bite stores, those what we might call convenience stores here in the United States, play a larger role in people's lives, and you truly can walk in and get stuff to eat that night, like enough for dinner, right, and then leave uh, pretty satisfied with what you're buying, and it's all very fresh food. And so they have a unique and different role in society. And if you've been to Japan, you've seen their vending machines all over the place, and it's so fascinating in Japan because they truly are just all over the place, and in spots where maybe there aren't a lot of people going to that spot every day, but the vending machine gets filled up. Somebody comes by and fills it up. Somebody comes by and pulls the change from the vending machine. And sometimes they're hot liquids, sometimes they're cold, sometimes there's food in them. And so those are a lot more common to see, and they're, positioned sort of just outside in the open, right? Whereas like traditionally in the United States, when you see a soda vending machine, for example, it's usually under some sort of cover or inside a building. These sometimes are just standing all by themselves outside in the elements. But that's just the way it's done. And it's really fascinating. And it makes for some really interesting imagery of like a small town in Japan, like a street corner or a streetscape, and there's just this vending machine in the middle of it. And it feels, I think, from a Western perspective, a little out of place. And so therefore like a little mysterious. But again, right, like this is just a way that I think Lego could use this type of medium to explore some just really, really interesting ideas. Now, that being said, do I think that'll happen? Not really. At the end of the day, I think I don't know if Lego's really willing to get that deep into the exploration or the intersection of food and culture and society, and to even maybe provide some commentary not only on how that society has integrated food and culture, but maybe how we as an external perspective feel about that too. But I think there is a really unique opportunity for that if they wanted to take it. At a minimum, if we got something like a ramen shop or a noodle shop from a Japanese restaurant, I think that would be wonderful. I really like to look at some of those interesting designs on Rebrickable of kind of Japanese streetscapes done in Lego. I think it's such a really interesting application of the Lego medium that I really feel like the Lego group has kind of missed out on, to be honest. We do get a little bit of it in the Ninjago series, but personally not as much as I think I would like. So I'm curious to see where this goes. Certainly, we could explore restaurants in the United States, although most of our restaurants either have kind of a modern or postmodern feel to them, or an international architecture style. So think a lot of glass. Think about kind of like your modern Starbucks that you see on the corner, right? And if we don't have that, we usually slant towards kind of a Western European influence in our architecture. And so I'm not really sure what exploring a United States cafe or restaurant would maybe do an American situation like that, but certainly there's a lot of different opportunities. Something like maybe Mexican themed or Latin American themed would be really fun. This would be a great opportunity to show in like to explore things like Cuban influences, right, and really use some great color or maybe some sort of Caribbean influence as well. So as you can hear in this podcast, the options I think are endless, and my mind is kind of racing, thinking about all the fun things that Lego could explore here with this new series. But I want to sit there and say, if you are feeling like you just don't really understand this quite yet, I don't think that's a bad thing either. I think those feelings are justified. And I would say that I don't think you are alone in the larger Lego community. So no harm, no foul. We'll just see where this one goes. And that's all I have for news this week and what I built this week. I can't wait to hear from Grinch on his experience, and I know many of you also can't wait. But let's move on to our main topic.
Today's topic.
And for our main topic this week, we are talking about the LEGO Creator Expert or Icons line, and specifically sets within that line that are aviation related or aircraft. And before we talk about those, I want to talk about two things. First is my own background in aviation. And as I've mentioned on past episodes, not only is my professional background in aviation, but it's also a bit of a passion of mine. And I would say that I have been interested in aviation since a really, really young age, probably before I even began to build Legos. And the two kind of have gone hand in hand in terms of sort of personal passions of mine. And not only did I have the opportunity to explore that in higher education, but I also was able to enter into the aviation field as a profession. And so when I see things like aviation and Lego, it's sort of this triple intersection between something that's both a personal passion of mine, a professional interest and passion of mine, and then also an intersection with Lego, right? And so I think that's really interesting. And that's one of the reasons why I just wanted to kind of carve out a smaller episode for today and for this sort of West takeover of the podcast, just to kind of talk about some really interesting sets and kind of talk about, some of the challenges of seeing or building aircraft specifically in the Lego form. And so before we talk about the Lego Icons line and the Lego Creator Expert line, I wanted to mention that, the sets that I'm going to talk about are not the only airplanes ever produced in Lego. In fact, it's not going to take a sharp listener to realize that, like, well, I'm not really going into details over like the Indiana Jones sets or the Island Explorers sets, right? Even Friends has had their own replication or inclusion of aviation into the Friends theme. I believe just this year we are expecting to see a Heart Lake City airport if it wasn't last year. So we just saw that. We just got a new airport in the Lego City line not too long ago. But there's one thing that's always stood out for me, which is just the difficulty of capturing scale in Lego or the scale of aviation in that Lego form. And if you're interested in looking at kind of partly how difficult that is, there's a really great designer called AFOL TV on YouTube. They have their own wonderful store online where they sell instructions, and they do a really great job of building these models that are hyper realistic in Lego. And one of the models that they've created is a Lego airport model. And it's actually really interesting because it's modular. So you have different portions of the terminal that you can connect together. And I think what comes to mind right away is just how big airports really are. And like I said, how difficult it is to capture and scale. And so not only is that the case, right, but then it's also like a case of how big airplanes are and how hard that is to capture and scale. And so when you see something like the Lego, passenger plane that sits that seats four minifigures, right? Well, that's not really a passenger plane. That's a what we would in the industry call a puddle jumper or a bug smasher, right? A small airplane, a general aviation airplane designed to fly around 5 or 6 people. And so you're certainly not making jet airplanes that are rather large, designed to only fly 4 or 5 people around. That's not really very economical for the operator of that aircraft. So I think there's some really funny scale challenges that we see in Lego, and not only does that present itself in maybe some of those issues, right? Like, and then we see like very small terminals and stuff, but we also see challenges in being able to capture just all of the mechanical details that we see in airplanes. And so at the end of the day, I think for someone like myself, an enthusiast, an aviation enthusiast, it just sort of leaves me. I like seeing the sets, right? I like seeing them in minifigure scale, but at the end of the day, something just doesn't quite add up for me to where I'm super excited about what I'm seeing in that scale from Lego. And I think there's too many compromises being made for me to be really, really excited about that, especially as like an adult builder. And I think, as AFOLs, anytime Lego explores something that we're really passionate about, I think there's kind of two camps of AFOLs, right? There's AFOLs who are maybe a little overly critical of that category of sets because it's something we're really passionate about. Or there's the camp of AFOLs who are maybe a little more accommodating because it's something we're really passionate about. And I don't necessarily think either one is right or wrong. It's just kind of part of the fun of being an adult fan of Lego, right? And the intricacies of how we engage in this hobby. And so, there are some really unique sets that Lego has made. Like I've said, they've made airports. Some of the best airports I've seen, or some of the more realistic infrastructure, I think, is actually in some of those Marvel sets, right? That the Lego or the battle at the airport from the Captain America Civil War movie had some really cool aviation inclusions. There's like that great fuel truck. We've had some really fun sort of city fire related vehicles to airports. I think there was an airport specific fire truck at one point that was kind of neat. But we've also seen some really, interesting stuff too in the Technic line as well. We've seen some really great helicopters, some tilt rotor stuff, and then we've also seen airplanes in like the 3-in-1 Creator series as well, right? So there's a lot of inclusions in airplanes, but I have 6 models in particular, and the 7th I want to talk about. But the 6th that I want to really kind of highlight here in the Lego Creator Expert line kind of all stand alone on their own because they're just so detailed and intricate. And those 6 sets are the Sopwith Camel, the Red Baron, the Wright Flyer, the 787 Dreamliner, the Sopwith Camel re-release, and the latest set in this series, the Concorde. And all of these, I think, are really unique sets. And we're going to talk about kind of some of the interesting aspects of this line a little bit later. But before we do that, let's kind of just talk about each one real quick. So the Sopwith Camel was the first aircraft that came out in this line. It was released in 2001. The price right now on Bricklink over the last 6 months for a new version of this set is around $256. I actually had this one or have this one. It's in pieces at the moment. But it is a large biplane from World War I flown by the Allies. And for the time, it was just incredibly intricate, right? There was some really great building techniques to capture the body as it kind of narrowed at the back of the airplane. And the scale of just Lego bricks itself lended really well to the thickness of all of the different structures. And so I thought this one actually still today holds up fairly well, right? A really great propeller build. So just ultimately kind of a fun set to have. Very much a display model at the end of the day. Now, I'm not going to be overly, complimentary to this set because these biplanes at the end of the day have a lot of straight features, flat wing surfaces, flat paneled surfaces on the actual chassis of the aircraft. And so this isn't necessarily an overly complicated build to capture in the Lego medium, some of the other models are that we'll talk about. Kind of to complement this model, the next year we got the Red Baron. This is the Fokker triplane flown by the German Luftwaffe in World War I. And this one is painted or, presented in the famous sort of Red Baron livery, all red with the Iron Cross on it. And, again, just another great model. Between the two of them, you could definitely see some improvements in Lego sculpting just in the span of 1 year, but ultimately kind of nice, 2 very complementary models. This aircraft, I think definitely more of a fan favorite. And right now, over the last 6 months, the average price for a new one of these sets is $476. To follow that up, we got the Wright Flyer in 2003, done in a tan and brown. And again, much like the biplane and triplane, lots of intricate building in between the wing structures and use of some string pieces to kind of, emulate or to replicate the wiring that was used to hold those wings together. Just another very fun set. I think between all of them, while this one has the second highest price in terms of, it costs the second highest amount of our list right now. I think this one was just a little bit more of a specialized model that I think really aviation fans in general enjoy, but I think you have to be kind of a hardcore, a diehard fan of aviation to kind of really enjoy the Wright Flyer. As an airplane itself, it looks very unique, and this was the first attempt at creating a flying, well, not the first attempt at creating a flying machine, but the first successful attempt, recorded attempt at flying a flying machine. And there was a lot of new stuff that the Wright brothers were just trying to figure out. They were very observational engineers, right? Not even formally trained. They were bicycle mechanics, if you remember. And they just used their power of observation to kind of put together what made sense, and a lot of trial and error. And they eventually got it done. And their airplane did fly for extended periods of time, beyond the few seconds and minutes of the first flight. But at the end of the day, there's a reason why airplanes don't look the way that the Wright Flyer does, and have sort of started to transform into what we maybe picture when I say airplane in your mind, right? And that kind of takes us to the next set in this series. And I kind of see this series sort of, if there's a niche sub-series here of LEGO Creator Expert Airplanes, these first four sets kind of fall within a sub-series of their own, in that they were all kind of released around the same time as each other. And I think that was certainly intentional on the part of LEGO Group, but you can see them start to space out after this next set. And this next set is the 787 Dreamliner set. And that one released in 2006, and right now is arguably, I think, the most popular set in the series. The last 6 months on Bricklink, the average price for this set new was around $658. This set kind of took this series and kind of pivoted a little bit. It's done in a similar format as the UCS sets in Star Wars, so it has its own blue and black UCS printed, or not printed at the time, right? But a stickered plaque and black stand. And the 787 model is actually modeled after the Boeing factory 787 with a Boeing livery on it. So it has this very gentle swooping line right about midship on the aircraft, that swoops up and then kind of comes back down over the wings and then sort of fades into the back of the airplane, which kind of, in my opinion, hasn't aged super well on this model. It's a complicated livery. It's not like maybe a simpler Delta one where the body of the aircraft is white and the wings are blue, for example, or United and Continental livery, or a American Airlines livery, for example. But it does look, I think, really, really interesting. This is back in 2006, where we didn't have a lot of curved pieces available for brick sculptors. And so this truly looks like something that was sculpted. And so you do see sort of the sharp edges of, your kind of standard bricks and plates, and, similar sculpting to what we would maybe see on like one of the R2D2s that was released, where it looks really, really good, but still has some of those sharp edges poking out that maybe make it a little more obvious, like this is Lego, this isn't a model, if you will. But again, a very sought after model for this series, and I think a really interesting inclusion. And we'll kind of talk about where maybe this entire series could go next, and I'll kind of point to this model as maybe one of those potential jumping off points for the Lego Group and Lego designers. Following the Dreamliner, we didn't get another airplane in the Creator Expert line until 2012, and it was actually a re-release of the Sopwith Camel. And I think this is a really interesting set because it just shows you how much Lego can change in the span of a decade. And so this set was released 11 years later. It's one of the newest airplanes in this series. The colors on it changed, and we started to see some of the techniques for capturing the curving lines of the fuselage change as well. And so instead of using just those hinge pieces and having some abrupt changes to the overall width of the fuselage, right, we started to see more sculpting and more specialized curved and arched pieces being used to kind of capture that detail. The propeller on this one is brick built rather than using the click kind of propeller that we see on a lot of sort of basic Lego helicopters these days. Introduced, kind of famously, that it was that yellow vane, control vane that they used on the Anakin pod racer, right? That has been recolored now in so many different recolors for helicopters over the years. And I think this is truly kind of the pinnacle of this model and series. I haven't explored it enough to see if maybe it tried to capture more of the moving control surfaces on this aircraft that we didn't see on the original one. And so I think this is one that I want to actually probably pick up myself. To get a new set right now, the average price on Bricklink over the last 6 months was $257. So just one more dollar average than the original Sopwith Camel. So I think pretty fair to say that it's maybe not the most popular version of this set, but I truly think probably one of the best looking airplanes that Lego has released at this scale. And that brings us to our last airplane on this list, and that's the Concorde that was released in 2023. It currently retails for $200 and has done some really interesting things. And as I mentioned with Lego and aviation, one of the challenges is capturing, I think, a lot of the mechanical moving parts of aircraft. Not only the detail of the sculpting of the airplane itself, but also things like the flaps, the control surfaces, your primary and secondary control surfaces, your rudder, your landing gear, right? And that's one of the hardest things to capture. And this is where the new Concorde really shines. And it has this really cool feature where on the tail cone of the aircraft, you can actually spin it and it lowers the landing gear. Now, again, for aviation purists such as myself, what we don't have on captured in this model is working landing gear doors. And so those landing gears are exposed out in the open, which wouldn't normally be maybe a terrible sin, but on something like a supersonic aircraft, that would be not possible at the end of the day to have landing gear out in the open like that. So there'd be entirely too much drag on the airplane, if not some significant structural concerns surrounding those pieces that were exposed. And so, here's one of those examples of where I think as an aviation purist, I start to struggle a little bit with this aircraft represented in Lego form, but I think that's okay. I actually have this model. I'm really excited to go build it, and I truly think this is really fun. What this one's done that the other ones haven't is we've gone away from some more simplistic printing or stickers, and on this model we have some really detailed printing and then some detailed looked at the interiors, right? So while the biplane and triplanes all had like a bench seat on the inside that was captured, right? The Dreamliner itself, you couldn't open that one up and see the inside, but now with the Concorde you can separate sections of the fuselage and see a breakaway section of what the inside of it looked like. So I think that's really cool. So that's kind of the 6 sets that I think make up this Creator Expert Icons line of Lego aircraft. But I wanted to talk real quick about kind of the contradictory nature of these sets. And for listeners who've just heard me describe these, I think one of the things that you might be thinking about was, hey, West, you just said that the Sopwith Camel and the Fokker triplane flew in World War I. So those are military aircraft. And you would be correct. And these sets even have the guns mounted on the top of them, as you would expect. And I think it's really interesting. Famously, Lego has said that they don't want to replicate or make sets that pay homage to, real world military occurrences. And they've done really well at kind of sticking to that line. Now they have done things like made Star Wars sets, right? So clearly they have they make a distinction between historical events and fictional events, but and certainly they don't play around with historical fiction, right? But yeah, we have these 2 sets, and one that was re-released again a decade later, right, as effectively warplanes. And so I think that's really interesting. I'm not entirely sure why Lego made that decision. If anyone knows or has any sort of gouge on why Lego was okay with that, but wasn't okay with something like the Osprey, please let me know, because I'm not sure I see the where that moral line in the sand was drawn. So I'm curious to hear kind of what our listeners think. But yeah, a really interesting case of Lego kind of exploring that. For listeners who maybe aren't familiar, the World War One was kind of known as the Great War, right? And so maybe there's sort of this feeling that because it was at the time 80 years in the past, and now at the time of our recording, almost a century or over a century in the past, maybe this is an okay topic to discuss and not a overly sensitive topic. I don't think anybody is still sort of sitting there debating maybe debating the merits of going to war, right? But I don't think anyone is sitting there saying like, well, one side was, uh, you know, poorly represented or to that extent, right? So we're not still arguing over the reasons that war occurred necessarily. And so I think that's maybe one of the reasons why Lego was okay with jumping into it here. But I think ultimately these are probably the only warplanes we'll ever see in Lego format on official Lego retail or for officially for sale by Lego. What's interesting though, if we kind of put those sets aside, we have then the Wright Flyer, the first airplane, right? The 787 Dreamliner and the Concorde. And we've seen now both an officially licensed Boeing set, the 787 Dreamliner, and the officially licensed Concorde set, right, which was actually made by Airbus back in the day. And so I think that there's an interesting opportunity for expansion here, much like we're seeing the Icons series kind of take on gardens of the world and now restaurants of the world. And we're seeing Lego kind of dip into things like exploring icons of racing with people like Ayrton Senna and Nigel Mansell for the newest set for that F1 series. Maybe it's time for Lego to explore icons of aviation, and to some extent we've already got some of those sets, right? We had that NASA space shuttle, which I thought was a beautiful rendition of that set. We had the lunar lander, right, which had the inclusion of the Apollo 11 astronauts, which I thought was really fun. We've had the Apollo 11 or the Saturn V rocket itself, right, featured in a Lego build. And so maybe we could see certain other airplanes captured in Lego format. Thinking about, or what comes to mind for me would be maybe a larger Amelia Earhart set, right? We got a gift with purchase Amelia Earhart set, but we didn't see the larger set. I think that could be really interesting. Maybe a Spirit of St. Louis set, right? With Charles Lindbergh, the first person to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. I think that could be really cool. There's also some really interesting ways that they could capture the history of aviation within Europe too, right? So there's some French aviation history that I think hasn't really been touched on here. And I'm going to potentially pronounce the name wrong, so I apologize, but I believe it was Blériot who made the monoplane, or was the first creator of the monoplane and crossed the English Channel. And so I think there's some interesting sets there, right? We've seen balloons in Lego before, and so we could see sort of the original aeronauts, as they called them, and some of those original balloons from the late 19th century featured in Lego. But maybe we could also see something like a Bell X-1, right? The first aircraft that broke the sound barrier featured in Lego. And that was a U.S. Air Force enterprise. And so if that is maybe, crossing a line that Lego just doesn't want to cross, which is totally understandable, maybe we could see some other icons of flight, such as like the 747, right, featured in Lego format. And, a very popular subject for a lot of our the larger Lego community. For aviation, such an interesting field because it connects the world in a way that I think sometimes, at least now, goes so underappreciated. But for a long time, it was such a novel technology and a novel experience that I think there's still a lot of nostalgia for when aviation had that kind of romanticism about being able to go and cross the world in a day, right? So Maybe something like a 707 or a Comet in Lego. The first jet transport would be really cool. I don't know. I think there's some opportunity here. Curious to hear what you listeners have to say. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me. I think there's certainly a line. Aviation's a really interesting industry because aviation and military aviation go hand in hand, and sometimes they intersect and intertwine in ways that not all industries kind of experience. And so certainly I think there's some areas where Lego wouldn't want to touch on, but like I said, I think there's some really interesting opportunities for expansion here for the Lego group as a whole, which brings me to a really interesting set that I just wanted to share. And I actually didn't know about it until I started researching this topic a little bit more, and kind of stumbled upon this on Bricklink and then went on to Brick Economy and to kind of pick up the background of this set. But Lego in 2012 created a set called Piper Airplane. It's set 4000012 Piper Airplane, and it was a inside tour exclusive set given to attendees of the Lego 2012 Inside Tour. Only 53 of these sets were made, and it is based off of the first airplane that the Lego group bought in 1962, a Piper aircraft. Piper being an American general aviation aircraft. And this airplane specifically is a twin-engine Piper built around a 4-wide scale. And it's kind of a fun set. It's got this little Piper airplane, what looks to be these little marker lights to make a runway, and there's a little windsock, and then there's a nice control tower build that's definitely a lot more detailed than control towers we've seen in the past out of Lego. This set is extremely exclusive, hyper exclusive even. The value for the set new from Brick Economy right now is around $11,000. Used around $2,500. That's $11,000 for 795 pieces. That's insane. But I think this would be, this is a really great example of kind of an interesting set that I think, as an aviation enthusiast, I would like to see. And I think other people would like to see something like this as well in kind of a more widely released format. So I just wanted to share that with the listeners. Again, not kind of one of the creator expert sets, but I thought a really unique aviation set in Lego that we haven't seen in the past. I really appreciate you guys listening in on this West takeover of AFOLs Welcome. Grinch will return next week, and we endeavor to continue to explore some really interesting conversations this year. We have some really fun guests lined up for later on this spring, and so I know Grinch and I have a lot of fun things on the back burner here that we're excited to get to include, following up our episode of the 5 Things Lego Does Well with a 5 Things We Think Lego Could Do Better episode. So please stay tuned for that. Next, let's talk through some Brick Mail.
Brick Mail.
And for Brick Mail this week, we have 3 emails and an iTunes review that I wanted to showcase. Our first email comes from Doc Man, who writes, "Hey guys, Happy New Year's. It's great to have you back in action over the holidays, and you started the year off with a bang with 2 great episodes. A comment for each of them. Episode 36, Things Lego Does Well, or 5 Things Lego Does Well. I loved this episode. Lego is such a well-run company that recognition of their areas of excellence was long overdue. Your customer service comments were spot on. My own experience has been great, but one incident was totally over the top. I'm a pediatrician and have 2 daughters. At the time my girls were growing up, there were just space, city, and castle themes at Lego, and there were no female minifigures at all. Nothing from the Lego group focused on young girls at the time. I decided to let Lego know about that gap in a letter, which I expected to be ignored. I shared my thoughts as a professional caring for children and as a dad. Much to my surprise, I received a personalized letter back from them, acknowledging that gap in their product line and their plans to correct that. They also mentioned that they had female minifigures in the past, but had to discontinue them. They sent me one of the discontinued princess minifigs in their response. I was stunned at the personalized customer service I received. I would also add quality control to their areas of excellence. With all the sets and bags I've opened, I've only missed one piece ever. That's quite a track record." And his second comment for episode 37 was, thanks for narrowing it down to your predictions between ideas and the Bricklink designer programs. There's just too much out there that will never get built for me to get excited. Other than sometimes voting in the Bricklink program, I tend to ignore them both in the developmental stages. With that said, I still enjoyed hearing you guys debate your predictions. Looking forward to the Star Wars episode with Mav Bricks. Keep up the good work, Docman. And this letter, I think, really sums up that customer service experience that we were talking about. And I know as Lego has grown, right? If for those of you who paid attention to his email, he was referencing a time when Lego just had city, castle, and space. So that was a few years ago. But I think that degree of customer service has continued to some respect. And I think at the end of the day, Lego is still a family run company with some just incredible family values. And by family values, I'm not necessarily, referencing like a desire to stay away from, sensitive topics necessarily. I mean, just in general, I think they have very warm, welcoming, and inclusive values. And one of the values that I think Lego has in particular that I mentioned on our episode was their ability to learn from their own mistakes and continue evolving. And they just seem to continue to do that over and over again. And they just keep getting better at what they do. And so while, yes, the relationship that I have with Lego is purely a consumer and producer's relationship, right? They produce the Lego, I consume it. Lego does a really great job of making it very difficult for me to want to go anywhere else to buy a plastic construction toy at the end of the day, because I know that it's part of their corporate values to take care of not only of their customers, but to learn from their own mistakes in the past. And so I just think that's really, really cool. And why, when we talked about our alternate Lego episode, I think Grinch and I maybe came across as being sort of a little too loyal to Lego. But I think this is why, my loyalty, at least to Lego, extends and goes well beyond just like their price points as kind of a, you know, I don't mind paying more for it when I know that the company I'm paying into is ultimately continuing to do so much good for not only their own corporate experience, but the consumer base as a whole. And I just think that's really cool. And I think this story of Doc Man's, where he got that discontinued minifigure in the mail from Lego in a personalized letter, not only acknowledging their own mistake, right? Like, how would that happen in 2025, right? Like, would we expect a corporation to do that? Maybe, maybe not, right? But a good one at the minimum, right? And so I just think that's really cool. And I think there's definitely more of that, where I think these days we just need to be like, hey, you know what? You're right. I messed up. Here are my plans to fix it, right? And I think that's just really neat. Our next email comes from Nick, and he writes, and he actually wrote us twice. So I'm going to read both of his emails real quick. And he says, sorry, I just got back from summer holidays here in Australia. Yes, another one of us. Thanks for the shout out on the pod. Your list is a pretty strong one. In terms of the things I've built, my list, McLaren Formula One, not a great year for Speed Champions last year, but as an F1 fan, wow. This year, wow. The Endurance, Planet Earth and Moon in Orbit, the Dark Falcon, and the Never Witch's Midnight Raven. I know the community is mixed on this theme. He's talking about dreams in this email, but I've built most of these and the figs are mind-blowing. Let's just hope they bring this level of detail and printing to the minifigs and other themes. I think this theme is really trying to push kids back into creative building rather than just following instructions. So anything that helps support the next generation of mock builders is a good thing. He then writes, just catching up on your new 2025 episodes, I just got back from Brickvention, which is our big Lego convention in Australia. Some of the team from Bricklink were there, and we got to see and help build the new Bricklink Designer Program sets that go live on the 4th of February. My take is that these typically are super niche. Only 30,000 will ever get made. Compare this to an idea set that must have a few 100,000 copies made worldwide. Walmart alone is likely to have 30,000 copies in the US. I think this is why we see so many massive castles and train sets make it onto the Bricklink Designer Program, yet almost none get through in ideas. I think they complement each other really well. Everything in the Bricklink Designer Program is crowd-funded, and for the hardcore fans, and then idea sets can be a bit safer with a little more mainstream appeal. Thanks for the great content, Nick. And I think Nick brings up a really interesting point here about that relationship. And I know I've been critical of that relationship in the past. And I still ultimately feel like that criticism is warranted. I do think there's some significant overlap between the Bricklink Designer Program and Lego Ideas. But I think he brings up a really compelling reason for why the two could coexist potentially, which is it does have this ability to kind of scratch that even more niche itch than Lego Ideas does, right? And you still have this ability to get these sets created and officially sanctioned by Lego in this very sort of low rate production process. But I would like to see, I think, within the Bricklink Designer Program, maybe a little more variation on what we're receiving. I do feel like we have to almost have like this obligatory castle set on every single series and this obligatory Western set on every single series. And maybe that's a sign, right? Maybe that's a sign to Lego, like, look, this is clearly a theme that adult fans of Lego are clamoring for. Maybe it's not a bad idea to continue to work in some sets every once in a while that these fans feel like are for them, right? And so that might be something, and maybe that is ultimately the purpose of the BDP, is a data mining process for Lego. So who knows? Kind of ultimately at the end of the day. But Nick, I appreciate you writing into the podcast, and I would love to hear more about Brickvention. So please, tell us more about your own experience and whether or not you got to display some stuff at that convention. Because this probably isn't a surprise, but neither Grinch or I have had an opportunity to visit Australia yet. So it'd be fun to hear kind of how you guys handle things down under. And our last comment actually comes on Apple Podcasts from LC-PI, I believe. And they write, amazing Lego podcast, the best Lego podcast, and one of the best podcasts in general out there. And I just want to share that I know both Grinch and I really appreciate not only the folks who reach out to us, because it's a lot of fun to hear from the larger community as a whole. We also appreciate anybody who's taken the opportunity to subscribe and to rate the podcast and to maybe leave us a nice note encouraging us. But we just appreciate our listener base in general, and we've seen, I think, over the last year, a desire for this type of conversation in the larger Lego community, and I think that helps us, helps motivate us to continue to make these podcasts. So I know it does for me. So I really appreciate that. And that's a wrap of another episode of AFOLs Welcome. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you are listening to this show. If you would like to write the podcast, please email us at afolswelcome@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram at AFOLs Welcome. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.